Federica. We've known each other for 30 years, and she actually is the reason for me meeting my wife, because she brought with her a German guy to my place, and my wife was the German guy's girlfriend, and I got her. So thanks, Federica.
You got to beat those Germans.
Sorry?
You got to beat those Germans.
Exactly. So, no, I mean, as Federica probably explained, I'm one of the 4 grandkids of Monnet, and for the past couple of years, I've devoted my time after a career in lots of different things, including mining, diamond mining, for a big international company called Rio Tinto. I devoted my time to leveraging my grandfather's heritage. So I've created this institute called the Jean Monnet Institute, and the idea is not really to do something to the glory of the great man. The idea is really to see, what can be useful today about him. What lessons can we take from his action that are relevant today? Okay.
Or I can bring this here.
Okay, never mind. I'm just gonna sit here, but I just don't. Okay, so what is it about what he did, his vision of the world, his method of action, his philosophy of action that we think can be useful in today's world? And we do know that we are in a situation that's not totally unlike the ones in which Monnet played a critical role through imagining new solutions, new structures, reflecting new realities of the world, and as Federica said, trying to really always unlock situations and find solutions in moments of crisis, of great tension, try to get the world to move forward. And obviously one of these key moments was the post-war period, and thinking about organizing Europe on a different basis. So for the newcomers, have you seen the movie or not? So yeah, Finn, have you seen the movie? Because I remember your name. I'm sorry, you're.
But I've been watching some videos of the next.
Okay, so I'll be. Have you watched the movie or not really? No. Have you seen some videos on Monnet?
Yes.
Yes, you have. Okay, so you're not starting from scratch, but basically, the reason why we're talking about Monnet today within the context of this course on Europe integration is that after the Second World War, he's really the man who came up with that deep conviction that Europe had to organize itself on different bases than it had for 300 years of Westphalian order before, where national sovereignty was really the basis for international relations, with everything it implies in terms of policies of prestige and opposition and domination, and leading to quite a few disasters, and that we had to change that world. And we also had to get over some, pretty deep adversities, a pretty deep opposition between France and Germany, which had resulted in 3 wars in the scope of 70 years between these 2 countries, and that had to stop. So, I'll come back to what he did before and how that led to his European role. But basically, the motivation at the end of the Second World War was really one, prevent future wars. How do we build sustainable peace within these European countries, which all came out really weakened out of the war, and none of them really capable of looking after itself on its own. So how do we build sustainable peace between yesterday's enemies, but going forward within that group of countries which were all quite weakened? The second thing was that indeed these countries were weak, and you had the US had reinforced itself pretty strongly during the Second World War, turning its economy into a war economy and really building its industry on the back of war. And it was pretty obvious that it was emerging as a formidable norming power at the end of the Second World War. And obviously you had also USSR that was forming, and it was clear that if Europeans wanted to be able to respond to the need of their population within that context, they had to find a way to unite and work together. So there are really 2 key objectives behind in Monnet's mind in pushing for a different way for Europeans to live together and build something new. One is build sustainable peace, and the second one is build prosperity, build conditions for shared prosperity. And the way that he believes that you build sustainable peace and shared prosperity is by creating unity, and you create unity by common action, joint action, creating the conditions for people to act together, to work together, to get to know each other. So you got to create that context in which nations and European peoples will be incentivized to get to know each other, will be tied through solidarities and interdependencies, and will be, as a result, create new types of relationships within them that had not existed before. I think it's really important to understand that the idea is really to create the psychological and the material context for peoples and nations to behave towards one another in a very different manner. And that's really the idea behind the European project. It is not an institutional project. The institutions only come to perpetuate a new mindset or a new way to behave, which is created by getting the countries together and getting the peoples together and creating a common and sharing a common goal. So how did he do it? And you've seen that in the movie, but I think it's really interesting to go back to it. First, he had this idea already in 1943. I think it's really interesting to understand that the war was not yet over. That already was saying there'll be war again when the war ends, if European nations rebuild on the basis of national sovereignty. And so we got to invent something different. And in 1950, that the actual moment to act comes around. The tension between East and West are at their highest. Everyone thinks a war is going to be coming. And at that very moment, the Americans and the British come to France and say, you got to do something about Germany, because it's starting to become a point of tension between the East and the West. That's such that is going to result in a war. We're going to find a way to really anchor Germany into Western Europe. And that's where the opportunity is given to Monnet. So Schuman at the time, who was the foreign minister, calls Monnet and said, do you have an idea? And Monnet says, I've got an idea. I've actually been thinking about it for 7 years. Now is the time to do it. And the idea is to bring together France and Germany by getting them to share coal and steel and pool these resources, put it under one independent authority that's going to be managing these strategic resources as one. What's really interesting about that move is it's not coal and steel, right? Coal and steel is just a way to bring the French and the German together. And what's interesting about coal and steel is that it is the very tool of domination that one country can use over another, whether it's industrial domination or whether it's military domination. The second thing that's interesting about coal and steel is that it's a point of friction, it's a point of tension. And Monnet understands that the best way to bring France and Germany together is to take that very point of tension, that very point of friction, the very tool and object of conflict and potential conflict between the two countries, and turn it into a common good that's managed for the benefit of all. And I think there is one thing that you need to remember about that coal and steel community is really this idea of taking the very point of friction, the very thing that separates, and turn that very thing that separates into a link, into a common good that actually brings people together. And that's a constant in Monnet's approach, which when you think of it is very powerful. And there is in the memoirs a very touching page which he writes at the time in 1975. It's a few years after the Kippur War, and he says, who will be able to convince the Israelis and the Arabs to do like we did with the French and the German, to turn the very point of conflict that opposes them, which is their land, and convince them to do something great together with it. That's if you think about what's the Monnet method of bringing people together, it's really that. If you take the point of conflict, the point of friction, you make it a common good and you get people to work together on it. And you create the conditions for a complete change in psychological mindset. Certainly the French and the German don't look at each other as enemies anymore. They look at each other as people who are tied, by a common interest, and interact within the context of new institutions in which there is an ongoing dialogue. They get to know each other, trust builds gradually, and over time they kind of deepen that integration because they find that they're stronger together. That's really the method that was applied to building Europe into the current union, is really to create these points of interest and expand them always, so that not only do we act together and manage to be stronger together, but also we build that ongoing dialogue. That means that we know each other, we trust each other, and eventually we find the common interest and move forward as a community. That's the European, that's the story of the European integration. And that's the beauty of the European adventure, which is really a human adventure of people getting to know each other, getting to trust each other, and finding that they're stronger together and that they've got a common interest in building that community. The other big revolution about, and then we'll move into exchange, but the other big revolution about the coal and steel community is, as I say, putting an end to 300 years of national sovereignty being the driver of international relations. And in fact, it's the first time that a group of countries that had happened before between France and England during the First World War under Monnet's leadership, but it's the first time that a group of countries agree voluntarily to surrender their sovereignty, and by merging it together on a very strategic dimension of their power and sovereignty, because coal and steel is essentially what you need to build power. That's what you need to build industrial power. That's what you need to build military power. In the same way as, if you remember in the movie, during the First World War, Monnet convinced the French and the British to share their shipping capabilities, and that was at the time for the British, what more symbolic resource and symbol of power than the fleet, right? And yet they brought it together and decided that it was to their benefit to actually share it, manage it as a common resource. That second step of supranationality within Monnet's itinerary is much bigger. I mean, you're talking about 6 countries, you're taking coal and steel, and you're bringing it together. So this sharing of sovereignty, merging of sovereignty on a specific topic, or specific resource, a specific area, is really the heart of the integration method that Monnet imagined. And the idea is not to relinquish sovereignty, as some people, and including nationalists and populists, try to say, that you actually give up your sovereignty. The idea is realizing that each of these countries on their own cannot exert their sovereignty anymore. If you got power, but it doesn't give you the capacity to act and to have your destiny under control, then you don't have sovereignty. And the idea by merging that sovereignty is to create a new common sovereignty that actually allows you to exert it, because you can't exert it alone, and you got to exert it together. By exerting it together, you create a new sovereignty. And that's really the idea behind the whole European integration, taking its root in the coal and steel community, is how do we create enhanced joint sovereignties at a time when we're not capable of exerting ours on our own. And I think it's really important to understand that. It has nothing to do with giving up sovereignty. has to do with enhancing sovereignty by sharing it. Because if you're not capable of exerting it on your own anymore, it means absolutely nothing. Actually, you lose it. If you can't exert it anymore, you lose it. The only way to continue to exert it is to share it and exert it together. That is again the foundations of the European integration. And I'll finish this bit that we can talk a little bit about that, and then we'll talk about the method. Monet's, how did it manage to convince people? How did it manage, not being in a position of power or formal power most of the time, how did it manage to trigger these great transformations? That's really interesting for all of us as human beings who want to change the world around us, or even want to take control of our own families and lives sometimes, whatever the perimeter, to understand a little bit how he did it. But as far as the kind of vision, the kind of integration vision is concerned, I'd just like to add a few things. One is the role of institutions. The idea is that collective action that you create by working together and working on a common interest can only be sustained in the long run if you create institutions that are going to be regulating it and perpetrating it. So the role of institutions is to perpetrate collective action. In Monnet's mind, is to perpetrate collective action and to enhance and to accumulate experience over time, to the point where, generation after generations, the institutions get wiser and stronger because they've accumulated human experience that essentially dies after you die. And these institutions are really, in his mind, the foundation of civilization. It is by bringing people together and nations together under common institutions that create the material and psychological conditions for solidarity, for joint action, that eventually you create a world in which people behave in a civilized manner towards another, build together, and enhance, bring everyone with them and enhance the life of the people, because that's really what it's all about in the end. And so this vision of of institutions as the foundation of civilization for Monnet didn't stop in Europe. Europe was the scale after the Second World War in which to apply that vision, but it really had a vision of that. It was a universal vision of that applying much broader. And starting with the United States, and we'll talk a little bit about it, I hope, he really saw the United States as one pillar, together with Europe, of a Western civilization built on values of the rule of law, equality of all members, and democracy. And the way for Europe and the US to be able to really project these values, because that was really the idea in the 1960s. Today we are being a lot more kind of we've been careful not to suggest we're trying to project our Western values to the rest of the world, and we realized it wouldn't work. But at the time, that was really the
Obama's speech in Cairo was exactly about that.
Yeah, but I think right now
That's why it wasn't bad received. It was very well received in Europe, and not as well in the Arab world.
But you can understand, but it was a different world, right? It was a different world. But I think it's interesting to understand that really Europe was seen as a step towards new forms of organization of the world. That his vision was really US and Europe being two pillars of that would be structuring international relations and structuring the way that peoples and nations must behave towards one another going forward, and that the only way for it to happen was that Europe had to be as powerful as the US, had to be at the same level. He understood the US very well, and he was very wary of the US temptation to abuse their power when they were in a dominant position. And therefore, Europe had to be built to be able to be a real counterpart to the US, so that then only could they build together a kind of world order based on the rule of law and so on. So, we're moving, quite far from that vision right now, but it's really important to understand that it was at the very heart of the European project, was not just about Europe. It was about Europe with the US and a vision of the world. And I think to an extent, it's still there today. I think when we talk about Europe today and our values, and we think about
the EU, is that you able to speak
Yeah.
at the same level with
No,
the
no.
US
no,
today?
yeah.
What do you think?
No.
Why? That's true, but what?
American exceptions.
Huh? Okay, go ahead, Mitch.
The United States is much more. I mean, for better, like. Not for better, worse, I think it's for better than we are in the world. Least enforcement. I think our influence is carries that our name. The exceptionalism is purely American exceptionalism, but I do follow that. Then.
Rachel, I see you wanna come in?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think the US is more powerful, simply because, we use the end of World War II as a way to solidify our power across the globe in a militaristic way. Like we have a military economy, and no one can match the military economy we have currently.
Yeah.
And we very much use the big stick method more so than, and we're willing to use the big stick method more so than most other countries.
So Money would have responded to that if you are the most powerful, you've got to be the most generous, and if you abuse your power at some stage, you lose it.
Yeah.
And so
I mean,
I think there's a question.
Yeah.
In what you're saying, is that real power,
no,
or is it an illusion of power?
I completely agree. I think, and I think that's true. We can see that in the way that the current administration is using their power and how much the world is kind of becoming more and more disillusioned with America and the destabilization of our relationship with everyone.
I think I know the.
I don't know if whatever order have Betty, Mitch, and Finn. I don't know who raised their hands first. You're on my shoulders.
Then one quick, so you're saying, if you can't exercise yourself, you lose it, because your realism, correct? So I want to see if, I want to vote. I want to ask you what you think about this real quick. If you lack means for violence, you're not peaceful, you're harmless.
Sorry, if you.
Lack means for violence, you're not peaceful, you're harmless. What do you think about that?
If you, sorry, I didn't understand it. If you haven't got the means for violence, you're not.
Lack means for violence, you're not peaceful, you're harmless, that's a statement.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is that what I'm hearing in what you're in what you're saying is that if you don't have the attributes of power, you can't build real peace in a sense. I mean, you're just being vulnerable and powerless, and it's not a good thing for peace. I think it's really interesting if you think of Europe as a union, a European Union as a union of 450 million people. US 300 million, 350 million. Europe has the potential to build a power base, whether it's militarily, whether it's economically, that can not compete with the US, but that can compare with the US. And I think the one reason why we don't do it is we're not united enough. We're not speaking with one voice. We're too fragmented. We're still very fragmented. We're still very fragmented as a market. People say that the difference in business laws and regulations between the 27 countries is equivalent to close to 100% of tariffs, trade tariffs. So we're not actually.
It's not really the problem, because we have the same here in the US. I mean, the different states regulate very differently, and the reality is that the regulatory.
But the business laws and so on.
it's the same, you establish yourself in Delaware, very different than if you establish
Yeah.
yourself in.
You can't compare the level of integration of the American market with the level of integration of the European market. Sorry? I don't think so. No, it's been calculated. Actually, it's actually been evaluated, the US and the EU. Well, that's my own belief is that we're still not integrated. The single market is still not there. Whether it's on finance, whether it's on goods, whether it's on services, the single market has not been achieved. And then we don't speak with one voice on a diplomatic basis. We don't have one single security. We're struggling with even the number of different systems we've got on the military basis. If you compare with the US, I mean, we've got 10 times the level of complexity we've got and fragmentation. It's completely ineffective in many ways as a union still. I think that's the reason why we haven't got the power. But there is a psychological thing as well for Europeans to want to be able to hold power and exert it. I don't think we see ourselves as a power, and we've built ourselves on the basis of the rule of law, peaceful relations, with very civilized in many ways. And that's great. That's the way the European Union was built, to be civilized, to behave in a very civilized manner towards one another. And I think we've been a little bit wary of using, exerting, and how to say, domesticating the attributes of power. And now we've got to learn to do that. We've got to learn to be a power.
We had Betty, Finlay, Luca.
I just want to say exactly what you said, that there's a difference with US against one voice, even though like there are several opinions for states, but still there's one federal government. And US doesn't speak its own voice. Like every state has different opinions and one different positions. So there's not really like the federal thing that would speak for all.
And you even have to take your driving test again if you move from one state to the other, which you don't in Europe.
We do.
Yeah, I had to take my test. My BC license was not enough, not enough to get a Colorado license.
I've been to
It depends from state to state. And then you're a student, so you have a special state.
That's been all I see. It's too easy to get the license.
But anyway, we had to
I
read.
know that.
So it depends on state agreements. So if the states recognize it or not. And so, yeah, I had to take my exam. Finlay, and then Luca.
Yeah, like I would generally agree that like the US is more powerful, yeah, because of the military and like, and because like we're one country, and we don't have to like go through like multiple, like what you said, like multiple sovereignties, even if it is pulled together. But I would say that like, I think in some ways, like other countries around the world, I think they might take the EU a little more seriously because they're more peaceful and then they're a little more stable, because it's like a broader union rather than like with us, especially like see like the new administration, like the administration comes in, like tariffs completely change, like relations between countries completely change, and that's like every 4 years pretty much. So.
Yeah.
Luca?
I actually disagree with that point. So like it would make sense that countries would be more willing to engage with Europe because they're more peaceful. However, like as is the case in Africa, countries would sooner turn to China because of the colonial history of Europe. And like because of that, because of how Europe kind of systematically screwed over the rest of the world for 300 years, and the fact that there's no kind of like centralized command. I think there has to be a reevaluation of the EU's power, collective power, because like the French like to think that they're an important international actor. The Germans like to think they're an important international actor. The Italians will just pretend like they are, knowing they're not. But like collectively, none of them can actually influence anything really. Like, we see that in Ukraine and we see that in Gaza and in Sudan.
In trade.
In trade. And like, yes, the EU has huge potential, but it's, right now, it's very far from
Yeah,
being realized.
I agree with that.
The interesting thing is that Monet was able, I mean, you have to think that in the early 1950s and the 40s, it was even worse. Europe was poof, completely destroyed. And yet he was able to think that Europe could become and should become powerful enough to talk one-to-one to the US, which eventually never did. That's the true reality.
But it's really important that I just as early as 1948, Monet was writing to Schuman, who was the finance minister before he became the foreign minister, a note in which he says the economic and military dependence on the US cannot continue. It was 1948, or we're going to have serious problems. So I think that there was a real understanding that Europe had to be built into a power in order to drive its own interest. Yes.
There's like giant dependence on digital services. And I think about like 8% of that or something like that's from abroad in Europe. Do you think it's even possible to like be digitally independent from the US?
I think it's a huge issue. Honestly, I think the dependence on digital and AI services, cloud data, we talked about it yesterday,
Oh, yes,
Is-
you know what?
is a real,
Was down? The whole Amazon Web Service was down.
yeah.
Yeah,
Cause I could power Canvas all day.
No.
It was awful.
I
Yeah.
know. But then it came to realize, oh, Canvas depends on Amazon Web Service. That it's actually no bueno.
So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge, I personally believe that the tools of domination, democratic, social, democratic, cultural domination, even military domination are going to be digital tools, and they're going to be linked to also the usage of AI. And the current dependence of European nations and businesses on American solutions, American cloud solutions, American data storage with very little protection, American AI AI algorithms that are totally uncontrolled and that are in the hands of individuals or companies that have their own interest, that are sometimes linked to government interest. And in case of China, it's even more obvious. I think it's a huge vulnerability for Europe, and I would put it at the very top of the priorities of the European Union to find ways to build that sovereignty. But it won't be about competing and replicating everything that the US is doing. We've got to find our own path, but I think it's existential threat, that dependence. I'd agree with that.
We have Dalia and Rachel.
Yeah, just speaking about AI, do you think, just in your opinion, do you think that's going to have a huge like impact in shaping future wars of some sorts just by like the information that we put in? I mean, this is something so minimal, but I would never put a picture of myself into AI, you know, because I wouldn't want them to replicate how I look like, my voice or anything like that. But do you think that could have some kind of influence?
I think it could. I think it can shape the minds. It can shape the minds of kids who use it. And if you don't control how it's done, if you don't have no governance over the algorithms and where they're finding the data and how they're being trained, you can screw with people's mind on a large scale. But
I have some on Instagram, but it's a private account, so hopefully minimizing my
The
risk.
public, but not to the data
Hmm.
owners.
Yeah,
That's
true.
that's the thing.
I mean, I think there's great ways to use technology, like I asked ChatGPT to, you know, help me make my study guide for this class, for my midterm. I know you don't, but like, you know, I put in.
I think you're right to do
information
it.
that we've been working on, and I said, hey, can you help me make a study guide? Take out the key points, what should I write on my flashcards so I can study them?
well, it's about learning how to use it, but being aware as well of how it works and how the engine is configured. Why don't we move back to Monet a bit?
Wait, we had Rachel.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
No, it's fine. I was going to move back to Monet as well. I was just, one thing that I was struck by in the movie was, his ability to predict important, like tensions before they happened. So, you know, during World War II, he was planning on peace already, is what they had said, and that kind of
Yeah.
theme happened where he was a couple of years ahead of where everybody else was.
Yeah.
I just thought that was really interesting, and
So why do you think that is, if you had to?
um. I don't know, I think probably in no small part, it's just experience, like life experience,
Yeah.
right? And getting. There's like a certain way to predict what people are doing if you spend your whole life studying people.
Yeah, I think it's a really good answer. I think he was just an extraordinary, he was extraordinarily connected. And his life experience, his network, he had an immense network made of, you know, people around the world that were very well informed. And he cultivated that network, and he was in touch with that network all the time. And you know, back in the US in the 50s, 40s, 50s, he was saying the best people to really understand what's going on out there in the world are the bankers, the journalists, and the lawyers, because they can't afford getting it wrong. They got to make, and he had an intentional approach to building a network that would help him build a view of the world that would be accurate and much more global than anyone else really would be. So he really had that ability to grasp the world and its globality through its multiple points of contacts that he was actively and intentionally cultivating. And I think it's a, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Still true of bankers.
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure if it's still true of bankers today. Probably, but the bankers today they live in the financialized world so much that they live in a parallel world. I don't think that was the case at the time. They were living in the real world because you didn't have that financialization of banking. But the second thing, which is really important, is that he made sure that he extracted himself from daily management of daily matters. And that's one of the reasons why he never sought a political position, because when you're in a political position, you've got to focus on much kind of you've got to you can't be long-sighted in the way you approach things. You're thinking about getting elected. You've got to you got a lot of things that you've got to attend to. And so your ability to take that global approach and take that long-term approach and give it the time to think it through is very limited. And he thought that was what his mission should be, because that's what he was good at.
Yeah.
But then building on what you said, there is this other element which is really important, which is how do you distill your understanding of the complexity of the reality, because he had that kind of all overarching view and that very long-term view of things. It means that he actually could grasp the complexity. But then when in his action, when you look at what he did, it's always quite simple. So just to come and say, France and Germany need to pull their coal and steel together under one high authority that will be independent from each of the states. It's actually quite a simple thing to understand, right? But so he was able to build a bridge between the complexity of the world, which is quite paralyzing for most people, and distill it into some very apparently simple solutions to actually try to modify that complexity and modify that situation. So is a really important aspect of the method, which I think we need to reflect on as people who want to change things, is how do you first grasp the reality of the complexity of the reality? Because you can only act decisively with strong convictions if you start from a reality that you understand. And a lot of effort and time was put into understanding that reality through all these connections, but also through these balance sheets that I described in the movie, where, you know, this ability to kind of get all the experts in the room and get all the data to build that reality that would then be shared with everyone. And from that reality, try to find the starting point to be able to move forward. And in the case of, for example, in the First World War, he didn't start directly in bringing the French and the British around shipping because he understood that it was too hard and too sensitive for the British. He started with wheat because everyone needs to eat. You know, they had to feed their army, they had to feed their population. So the British were ready to start with wheat, kind of sharing sovereignty over the buying and the distribution of wheat across France and Britain. Once they'd understood how it worked and that they had trust in their French counterpart and they realized that actually it was effective, then they were ready to move to shipping, which was the big prize that Monnet was after. And he started working on them in 1914. It only happened in 1918. So finding the right starting point, like coal and steel was the right starting point to start triggering a movement and change the context in which a problem presents itself so that new solutions would emerge. Is the other side of that coin that you're describing of grasping that reality, being able to see things before the others by having that long-term view and global view, but then distill it into, okay, what does that mean for today? What's the next step? And the next step is the most important. It's not intuitive where the next step is. And I think for us today, it's not intuitive where the next step is for Europe to kind of break the deadlock we're in today, where we're paralyzed by the complexity and the fear of what's happening in Ukraine and our ally kind of moving away. And, you know, we're paralyzed at the moment. So
We are also bombarded with a lot of information, pertinent and non-pertinent. So there is
that's exactly it.
noise today than there was at Monnet's time.
So how do you distill? How do you create a reality? How do you distill that noise into what's relevant, what's important? Create a reality that everyone can be aligned on, and that can help you identify where the next point is. That's going to be. So I think you're right. It's a lot more complex today than it was at the time. So we need these skills and we need that approach even more. But if you think of the few ingredients that allowed Monnet, besides what we've just been talking about, to kind of have such an impact on so many different occasions, looking at the movie, what do you think these are? How did he act? What kind of struck you in terms of the way that he led or acted that kind of explains, to an extent his impact? Yes.
So in the movie, as we mentioned earlier today, that Monet was like, his bigger picture was expanding something like the EU into the world. But what would that look like? Would there be an international government, like a single market for all countries, or would it be a slow expansion beyond the EU or beyond Europe? So maybe like involving North Africa or Canada or the United States. I was wondering, like, if he had a kind of frame.
Okay, so I think he was very wary not to lock himself into an end game picture, a clear end game. And he was a mountaineering, and he was always using that picture, saying if when you climb a peak, when you're at the top of the first peak, you discover a whole new reality, a whole new set of options that are going to probably change the trajectory that you're going to want to take. And building the kind of the world order of tomorrow is going to be exactly the same thing. You got to have a direction, you got to have principles. There is an element of kind of moral, there is a kind of moral foundation to the direction that he wanted to take. I mean, it's peace, it's unity, it's solidarity, it's shared prosperity. I mean, there is a strong compass, and he thought that would be done by bringing people together on a larger and larger scale continuously, and finding the path to continuing on that path and always going in the right direction and finding the right peak to climb, and then from the next peak, identify what's the next peak that you want to climb. That was the image he was using. So he didn't have an end game, but maybe if you asked him to do one, he was a universalist, and he probably thought that as problems are more and more global, as the nation is no longer the context in which to solve today's problems, probably the continent will not be the scale on which to solve tomorrow's problems, and we've got to think about broader governance structures that will allow us to tackle together common problems. I'd be very interested in knowing what it would have done of the climate crisis, which is by definition one that doesn't know any border, and that has to be tackled as a global crisis through global action. And yet we don't have today the vehicles, the institutions, the governance to be able to do it. And I think that would really challenge his thinking. But I don't think he had the final game. Like, he didn't want to talk about really a federation or confederation, what it should look like. But he had that vision of a global order that would allow humanity to solve its global problems together through global action. Sorry, no, you had a. But can we go back to his way of acting? What do you think? What do you think he was? Because it's quite extraordinary when you think of it, right? The guy didn't go to school. He was a cognac merchant, 26-year-old. He finds his way into the prime minister's office, convinces him to work with the British to create supranational bodies that are going to be managing all these war resources as one, within a few years. Then it becomes a key architect of the Victory program, plays a key role in convincing Roosevelt and the Roosevelt administration to turn the US economy into a war economy. Then, becomes the architect of French modernization, bringing the workers' unions, the industrialists, everyone together to work together and rebuild France. Obviously, the coal and steel community, bringing the French and the German who'd been still at each other's throat a few years before to actually share their most strategic resources and move forward on a completely new basis. There's got to be something about this guy and how he acted that allowed him to have such an impact.
Yeah.
What do you think that might be?
I kind of wish the movie got more into like how he practiced diplomacy, because I felt that when they were addressing things like the steel and coal community and his conversations with Roosevelt, and even his relationship with Roosevelt, which seemed really profound, especially in his funeral. They just kind of said that he convinced them, but we didn't really hear like any conversations or proposals.
Everyone wished they were a little mouse in these conversations that Monnet had, and people who knew him well and observed him used to say he can't write, he can't read, he can't write, he can't read, he can't speak, but he would persuade about anybody. And I think the answer to your question is an extraordinary persuasion power. And where does this persuasion power comes from? If you can't write, you can't read, you can't speak and persuade anybody, is an extraordinarily strong conviction. And I think what really sets Monnet apart and explains a lot of his efficiency is simply the strength and the depth of his own convictions. And he is, he decided not to be a public figure. He decided not to be a politician because he thought he didn't have it in him, and that it wasn't the best way for him to have an impact on events and minds. But he knew how to convince, because it started selling his cognac, his small brands, to everyone in Canada, the US, when he was a sales guy for his ideas, but he was incapable of not starting from his own conviction as the rock on which he would build his action and on which he would convince and persuade others. And he had a very intentional way, a very deliberate way of building these convictions. And you see in the film, we talk about these walks, these meditative walks. He had a practice of which I would call a meditative practice of meditation walks every morning. We spend an hour and a half walking in nature and thinking very deeply about building his convictions, forging his strong convictions about what needed to be done. Once he'd done that, he would go into some kind of meiotic practice, exchange with his team and colleagues, where they would kind of challenge these convictions and challenge these the formulation of these convictions, to the point where there was a very, very clear idea, very well formulated, and the conviction was so solid that no one would stop him in persuading others, and that would be the base for an extraordinary determination. So people who talk about Monnet who knew him said they'd never seen anyone as determined as him. And I think the determination comes from the strength of the conviction. If you're not sure about your conviction, if you're not sure about what you think needs to be done, that's when you start hesitating. That's when you go back. When you hit an obstacle, you think, okay, maybe it wasn't the right thing, and you go somewhere else. He was so convinced that he actually, when he saw an obstacle, he thought, okay, well, that's the stepping stone to step on and keep going. So the conviction was an extraordinary element, and I would really, what I take from it personally, and I would really encourage you to think the same, is really think about what your own convictions are that you're acting upon. How deep are they? How much you've challenged them, and how much you've carved them to the point where you're so convinced that nothing is going to stop you. And take the time to do it. It's not something that you do in 5 minutes. He was actually saying, that's where I work. You know, it's these hour and a half every day that he was spending out in the woods, thinking and forming and clarifying his mind, and his conviction was really, you know, where he worked. He said, that's where I work, because then the rest action was just flowing naturally from it. So how much time do we spend forging these convictions, clarifying what really we believe in? That's going to be the base for our action and for our life and for our direction. Well, I don't think we spend nearly as much enough time doing that. And another key element, I think, of his efficiency is self-awareness. He early in his life realized that even though he would have loved to be a charismatic orator, that just wasn't him. He had this ability to convince. He had these persuasion skills, and he had these deep convictions, and he had this total inability to act against his own conviction. That's the worst mix for a politician. If you want to be a politician, if you want to be a party member, you've got to be able sometimes to sit on your convictions. You've got to be able to act in a way that's not necessarily totally in line with that, and you've got to be able to you got to have a level of egocentricity, that because you got to promote yourself, and that's something he was totally incapable of. So very early he realized in his great maturity, which he built here in this country, you know, going from customer to customer, you know, age 18, 20 in the Wild West, selling his cognac. He had this maturity to realize that if he wanted to have an impact on the world and wanted to move things forward, he would need to build on his strength and not on his weaknesses. And his strength was his ability to persuade. So his mode of action would be influencing others. That's the way. So he would influence politicians. He would influence Prime Minister in France in 1914. He would influence Roosevelt at the time of the Victor program. He would influence Schuman to act and take and defend his positions. And he built this big lobby in 1955, exactly 70 years ago, almost to the day. That was about in which all big European parties and unions participated to do what? To go and influence the politicians in power to make the right decision. So to have the maturity to say, this is what the kind of leader I'm going to be, and this is going to be my tool of action. I'm going to use influence as a tool of action because that's my strength. And I'm going to be maybe giving up some dreams of this and some dreams of that, because that's not how I'm going to be able to impact events and touch the minds and change the course of events. That's what he wanted to do. I think it's another great lesson to understand, to build a self-awareness that's necessary to choose the mode of action that's going to be yours. That's going to be your way of impacting the world around you. You know, it might be the whole, you know, the world like in case of money, but it can be your small world, or it can be the perimeter in which you want to have an impact. But I think for me, that's something that I've been using in my own professional life, is what kind of leader am I? And what kind of tool to my own mission am I? And how do I use that tool, understand that tool and use that tool and refine that tool to the point of being extraordinarily effective? And he really did that. When he was 65 years old, 1953, is when he started the coal and steel community. He was 65, an age at which many of us hope to retire. And he wrote something in his personal note that said, my life only starts now. Everything till now has only been, I think we talk about it in the field, because I think it's just so moving. Everything till now has just been learning, attempts and trials. And I think it really shows an approach to himself of instrumentalizing himself as the tool of his mission, and the need to know that tool and refine it and improve it all the time. But I think is a really interesting way to also look at yourself. If you're the tool of your mission in life, whatever that is, or what you want to achieve in life, then you look after yourself and you start looking at yourself differently. You're not the end, you're the tool to an end. And that's really the representation of himself that he had. Yeah.
Yeah, I wrote that quote down when I was watching the movie because I thought it was pretty extraordinary. I think most people that would have achieved what he had achieved in his lifetime would not have said something like that. And like I think it shows the kind of like control over his ego. And it was reassuring to me because I'm 22 and I'm thinking, man, I should know everything by now, and I'm graduating and get a job. But then when I saw him say that, that was really cool.
Yeah, control over his ego is because he did have an ego, but his ego was not to exert power or be rich. Or his ego was in seeing his ideas become common goods. He sees his idea change the world. That was where his satisfaction was. That's where his power was. And so understanding where is your ego and how you control it and where you get satisfaction from is very important. So yeah. So anyone wants to reflect on that?
Give me a second. Take back the start. Fashion.
Can you speak louder? I
was thinking, I need a second to formulate the stop, then I lost it. Okay.
Yeah. The other, if I continue a little bit on his method of action, because I think it's useful, you all the rest you can get from the movie and from, but understanding how he acted. So the mode of action, so it started from conviction. The mode of action was influence, but then there are similarities. If you look at every big moment of transformation, there are things that come back. The first one is a moment. There is a moment when things are so confused, people are so lost, and everything is so dark and worrying that decision makers are ready to hear anyone who comes with a solution that sounds applicable and gives a way forward. And so the idea of picking the time, when he goes to the prime minister age 26 in 1914, he comes right after the Marne battle. 500,000 kids were killed, mostly French and Germans within a few days. The government is in Bordeaux, they're completely lost. I mean, there is, and here he comes with light. Actually, this is the way forward. We've got to start working together with the British, and that's the only way forward. And the guy listens to him and tells him, okay, it sounds like you can do it, you do it. So understanding the time, there is a time for action. People are ready to take your ideas. And I think it applies to everyone and whichever environment you're in, whether in an organization, whether in your own life. There is a moment when people are ready to hear the one who comes with a solution. And you can achieve extraordinary things if you're capable of identifying that moment and coming with it. Same thing with the Franco-British Union. You've seen in the movie this thing that no one really knows about. that French and England were ready to merge into one single country. No one knows that. 1940, just before France surrendered, the French government and the British government and Churchill in his cabinet agreed to merge France and England into one country, one parliament, one army, one people. It would never have been possible, 2 months earlier. No one would have listened to that. 2 months later, France about to fall, and with its whole fleet in the hands of the Germans and so on, and people are ready to accept extraordinary, the unthinkable becomes possible. And I think that's something. So the moment is really, Monnet has a sense of timing. He knows when people are ready to hear his solutions and his ideas. Schuman in 1940, the Americans put pressure on Schuman to come with a solution for Germany. And he knows he's got a window of opportunity of a few months to come up with something that's going to change completely the dynamics in Europe and start a new era. And that's when he comes with coal and steel. So the moment is really important. The second thing is the lever. He understands that if you just remain on general terms, like we do in Europe at the moment with the Draghi report and all these reports that say these are the 350 things we need to do. If you stay at that level, nothing is ever going to happen. But if you're capable of narrowing down on one thing that's going to lead on to anything else, that's a practical, concrete step. That's the thread to pull. That's really going to start triggering a movement. That's going to it's going to lead to the next change and the next change. Get the ball rolling, then you can achieve anything. It's the idea of the wheat, bringing the British and the French around wheat in the first place, getting the Brits to change their mindset, and then eventually get them to where you want. But finding that starting point, that trigger, it was coal and steel clearly the trigger that it pushed on. All the triggers that we exerted in Europe since then, using exactly that method, is the single market, the single currency, Schengen. These were big mind changers and game changers in Europe. And the critical thing is, how do you have the ability to not only identify the moment, but also identify the point to press on? And it's true in every complex situation. And I think today you're talking about digital and AI. I think there's the Europeans are struggling today because they're incapable of finding that point to press on. That is going to get the minds back into motion. This is going to create a positive kind of virtuous cycle of change that's going to allow the Europeans to start moving forward again. That point needs to be identified. Personally, and Federico would disagree. Personally, I think that point is probably in the digital or AI space, because in the same way as coal and steel was the tool of domination yesterday, digital and AI will be the tool of domination tomorrow, and a much more powerful one, I think, on our democracies. There are people who are after the European Union today because of what they represent as a democratic community that solves its problems in a peaceful manner. And they will use these, and they are using these tools today to undermine us. Sorry? Yeah. Okay. No, good. Stopping in 2 minutes. The third thing, and I'll wait for that. I'll stop with that. Is find the man. So the time, the lever, and the man. And every time he finds the man in power, he's capable of reading the power lines and reading where power lies to be able to get his ideas implemented by people who've got the power to do it. In the case of the Victory program, it's clearly Harry Hopkins, who's got the trust of Roosevelt, and whom he can get to Roosevelt through, and cultivating that. And then obviously Roosevelt, is the one who kind of allowed it through the famous arsenal of democracy metaphor and what that whole triggered. So a leader as a strategy of action for someone who was not in formal position of power, but had that ability to understand the landscape, find the the starting point and had the conviction to actually change, that he could change the course of events and the course of minds, and he actually did. So I'm done within the 2 minutes. Now, if anyone wants to kind of reflect on that, or how useful that is.
Something that I was struck by, wasn't what you were talking about in the movie, was just his ability to get to really important people really quickly. Like, just imagine some random 26-year-old kid now attempting to speak to the prime minister, like just going to the prime minister saying, hey, I have something important to talk to you about, right? And just like having the amount of conviction that would require to get an interview with the prime minister with like nothing more than.
So it takes conviction and it takes disregard for authority.
Yeah.
And he was essentially a transgressor. He didn't respect authority for its own sake. He was stepping on the head of ministers and so on, because what had to be achieved was more important than any kind of personal consideration. And he would never let people issues come in the way of what had to be achieved. And yeah, it takes a certain, I dropped out of school age 15 because he couldn't take the authority from the teachers. It takes a certain personality and confidence as well to be able to do that.
Yeah, I just thought that was really interesting. Can you imagine someone today, like?
Yeah. But you have to be transgressive if you want to change things. If you want to have a real impact, you can't just play by the rules. You got to be transgressive, and you got to not let people issue come in the way of and politics. Unfortunately, has become about people. You got a great example here in the US, where it's all about people. It's all about one person. That's a recipe for disaster.
I'm thinking, how much did he see value? And I think, obviously, better to see value than executing the change you want to see, without waiting for the perfect conditions, executing because it has to get done. Like Robert said, the fight, what I mean, you have, not what you don't. So he value that. I see it, but what do you think? Did he value that, getting it done with current conditions?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. He was very much a realist, and he understood the current situation. He put a lot of time and effort into building a clear picture in his mind and other people's mind of what the reality was. And very often, when people don't agree on the way forward, and conflicts arise not because they've got different opinions, because they don't agree on the reality. They don't put the same word behind this, the same meaning behind the words. So understanding the reality for all its imperfection, and being able to go ahead without the full solution, just based on this is what I know and this is where I know we need to get, and what's the best possible solution within that context, but not waiting for the perfect one. I think that would summarize very much his spirit. I'd agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really interesting question, because you mentioned, I forgot who he was talking to, but somebody was asking about the European coal and steel community, and he said he had been thinking about it for 7 years. But like, something like that doesn't just happen because the timing is right, right? Like, you would have had to push for it, and like fight for it. Not it just kind of all falls into place.
Yeah. No, you're right. So essentially, he formulated in 1943, middle of the war, he formulated the idea of the coal and steel community. And extraordinary because he formulates also the principle of a peace of equals between France and Germany as a base for a European community in 1943, in the middle of the war. He's still at war with Germany, and he already has that foresight that a peace will have to be built on equality. He had the experience of the 1919 peace. He was the second in command of the League of Nations 1920, and he realized that any kind of partnership or any common project can only be built on the principle of equality. So he had formulated these ideas already in 1943. What happened in 1950 is the window of opportunity opened. It didn't just happen like that. There was a window of opportunity people were, the situation was so tense that a war was coming. Everyone was convinced there was a war. It was just such a crisis moment that he thought now is the time to get people to accept something they would never accept in normal circumstances. And that's where he went into action mode. And I like to say 7 years of reflection, 2 months to change the course of history. He went into action mode and started convincing going out there and convincing everybody from the first contact from Schuman in March till the Schuman Declaration in May. It's just 2 months of extraordinary agitation and conviction and action. It doesn't just happen like that. If he'd not come up with that solution, probably the Americans would have come up with a solution to put Germany under some kind of US command and so on, West Germany. That would never have led to the European community that would have created, that would have reinforced yet the dependence of the Europeans over the Americans. So you're right, it doesn't happen like that. It takes someone or some people to come with conviction and trigger the change. So I've got to release you, I think.
Yeah, the next.
So, yeah, exactly. Sorry for keeping you a bit longer, but I enjoyed the exchange.